Теории. Простые, стройные, известные каждому со школы, будут опровергнуты. Забытая история.
3:06 p.m. local time. Radio station Moscow is speaking at 94.8 FM. Olga Baikalova in the studio. This is the program, Forgotten History. Today we will talk about the end of the world in the world mythology. In our studio, we have Gleb Nosovsky, an associate professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, and co-author of the concept, The New Chronology. Gleb Vladimirovich, good afternoon.
Hello.
Let's remind everyone of our contacts.
All right, although this has nothing to do with mythology.
Today, we will still talk about the end of the world. The topic is endlessly fascinating. There will be many questions. To start with, let's understand what we mean by the end of the world.
The end of the world is a theory, an idea that has more to do with chronology and church tradition than mythology. It also relates to the new chronology because it's one of the most important concepts in chronology and in understanding our past. This includes the anticipation of the end of the world, the calculation of the end of the world, the origin of the idea of the end of the world, and how it has been perceived in human understanding, imagination, and science. Up until the 18th century, calculating the end of the world was a part of academic science.
It is science.
Yes, back then. Of course, now it is no longer considered science. But until the 18th century, it was considered part of science, and quite academic scientists, even in the 18th century during Newton's time, were carrying out these calculations. By the way, Newton himself was interested in this.
You mentioned that the concept of the end of the world is more related to church tradition. But what about, for example, the Maya tribes and other primitive tribes that also believed in something similar?
I'll talk about the end of the world according to the Maya calendar supposedly in 2012 at the end. It is indeed a very interesting topic, but more on that later. Because right now it would be unclear.
All right, we'll definitely discuss that. Then it will be clear from the logic of this broadcast what we are talking about. Good. The idea of the end of the world has quite profoundly permeated human history for a long time. Let's then delve deeper into the Christian tradition. What is the core idea?
Not a long time, but throughout our entire written history. Let me remind you that according to the new chronology, the written history of humanity begins with the era of Christ. Written history is the history from which written sources have reached us that we can read. According to the usual, well-known, and widely accepted chronology today, if we mentally survey the entire chronology as proposed by historians, supposedly from 5000 to 4000 BC, where the pyramids in Egypt are, the era of Christ is closer to us. Up to our time, the year 2000 AD, it's approximately a 7,000-year period, in which the era of Christ is 2,000 years ago, so it's closer to us than to the beginning of this period. In the new chronology, the written history of humanity starts from the era of Christ. Essentially, according to the new chronology, we know nothing or very vaguely about events before the era of Christ. That is the ancient pre-written history. Pre-written not in the sense that people could not write back then, but in the sense that those written sources have not reached us, that writing has been lost, and so on. Of course, we can view written history not from the moment writing was invented, which happened quite a long time ago, but from the moment when written sources became more stable and reached us, or we reached them, so to speak. Therefore, according to the new chronology, all our written history is Christian history. This must be understood. In this sense, although the new chronology rejuvenates the era of Christ in the absolute sense, bringing it more than 1,000 years closer to us, in the relative sense, it makes it more ancient. That is, relative to all other events, it makes the era of Christ more ancient, and this era becomes the oldest in our history. The idea of the end of the world dates back to the very beginning of Christianity and indeed permeates our entire culture. I will later share some thoughts and hypotheses on where this idea came from, but for now, let's not focus on that. The idea emerged, and it is known that it originated from somewhere, with Christians asserting from the start that the world is finite. Incidentally, it's interesting to consider that such an idea is quite intriguing, and it would have been strange for people to arrive at such a conclusion out of nowhere. Nevertheless, they did. For some reason, they came to the idea that the world is finite, that times are finite, and that everything will eventually end. From the very beginning, since the era of Christ, the Christian Church has discussed when this would happen. We've talked about the end of the world. Now let's turn to chronology, and then these two threads will merge. Chronology is the calculation of time in the past, the recording of ancient and not only ancient but also modern events in time. However, it turns out that recording contemporary events and recording ancient events in time are significantly different things. If we turn to ancient times, we will see that chronological systems and methods of dating have been changing.
When we talk about ancient times, our listeners need to understand which specific centuries we mean.
Let's not clarify that for now.
All right.
Because ancient times are ancient times both in the conventional chronology and in our chronology. Yes, in absolute terms, they are at different points in time from us, but intuitively, we understand what ancient times are, and the intuitive concept of ancient times is the same in both the new chronology and the conventional chronology. So, let's not specify for now. I will clarify over time.
Let's try. All right.
Let me repeat once more what I started with. The era of Christ is the beginning of our written history. The era of Christ is the 12th century AD, which occurred approximately 800 to 900 years ago. This is the starting point of our written history. But according to the new chronology, ancient times ended even later. In general, ancient times, both according to the new chronology and Scaliger's chronology, refer to the era before the adoption of Christianity. This is usually considered the case. Antiquity, the ancient period before the adoption of Christianity, after which the Christian Middle Ages begin.
Egypt, the Maya, the Aztecs.
Let's set aside America for now.
All right, let's set it aside.
Let's not get too scattered, right?
Okay, I won't interrupt you anymore.
Let's talk about Europe, to avoid mixing everything together. What are ancient times in Europe? It's antiquity, various Bacchic cults, ancient Rome, and so on. Then, after the adoption of Christianity, all this transitions into the Christian era. This happens similarly in both the new and the old chronologies. Simply the transition point is different. In the Scaliger-Petavius chronology, it's the 4th century AD, about 1600 years ago. In the new chronology, it's the 14th century AD, about 600 years ago. That's the only difference. But for now, let's discuss qualitative evaluation, ancient times or early Christianity. In fact, the idea of the end of the world hasn't undergone significant changes from ancient times, through early Christianity, and even up to the 18th century. It existed and still exists, though no longer within science, whereas it used to be part of science. Let's talk about something else, chronology. I want to return to chronology, and then we will bring everything together. How did ancient people measure time? It is known that the simplest method was by the years of the reigning ruler. For example, the nth year of such and such emperor, the nth year of such and such ruler. In Japan, by the way, they still count time this way. If you go to some remote place in Japan, a person might not even know that it's 2015. They know the year based on the reign of the current Japanese emperor. This is documented everywhere there. They know these years better than the common calendar we use. It has always been that way there. In Japan, this system is preserved. We had this system too. If you remember, in the Gospels, the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This is the only date mentioned in the Gospels. It's indicated by the year of the reigning emperor. This is a natural system of timekeeping. I want to point out that I will now be discussing the common and public timekeeping systems, not the ones used in scientific works. Because in scientific works, among astronomers and specialists, they had other systems.
That is, we won't use a star map to navigate?
No. One thing is what they're discussing in the Academy of Sciences today, and another thing is what they're discussing on the streets. These are slightly different topics, different things. Right now, we're going to talk about what's happening on the streets.
But in your analogies, you rely on what's happening.
I'm going to talk about the commonly used calendar. Because what calendar was used by scientists, astronomers, and so on, is a different issue. They had different systems.
Was the concept of the end of the world considered scientific back then?
Back then, the concept of the end of the world was considered scientific. But because scientists knew more, they knew how to deal with large numbers. They dealt with calculations. From the very beginning, even from the time of the Almagest, they used other, more advanced methods of reckoning time, which society reached later. Initially, simpler methods of reckoning time were used in society, namely by the years of an emperor's reign. And this satisfied everyone for quite a long time, until people started delving into history and chronology. And they discovered that it's very difficult to understand old sources where the years of reign are given according to certain emperors. Because to do that, you need to know when that emperor ruled, paced his reign, and place his reign on a temporal axis. This couldn't always be done just by looking at old sources. Therefore, even in ancient times, scientists introduced what's called the indiction chronology, according to which the year was counted not with 1, but with 3 digits. There were 3 cyclical counters: lunar cycle, solar cycle, and indiction. Lunar cycle ranged from 1 to 19, solar cycle from 1 to 28, and indiction from 1 to 15. Each year, all these counters simultaneously increased by 1 and cyclically reset. That is, when lunar cycle reached 19, the next value was 1. When solar cycle reached 28, the next value was 1. When indiction reached 15, the next value was 1. The trio of such cyclical counters allowed determining the current year very reliably, expressing it with small numbers. Because in ancient times, people did not study in school, and large numbers were considered a kind of high science that they simply didn't understand. This method of reckoning time allowed society to denote years in a language it understood very reliably. Moreover, it is very stable, because if some digit got erased, say, in indiction, then with the help of the other two counters, one could understand which year it was. Provided that we know it's a modern date from my lifetime or my parents' lifetime. If a person knew that it pertained to their time, they could reconstruct the year. All this lasted for quite some time, and not just some time. If we take, for example, Russian chronicles and sources, we will see that remnants of indiction dates were still used in the 17th century. Even in the 17th century, when dating, although they no longer always indicated lunar and solar cycles, they still specified indictions for quite a while.
Who was the first to introduce the indiction system?
This is unknown.
This is unknown.
That's what I'm saying. It's an ancient method of time reckoning. It gets lost in the ages. In our new chronology, we have some ideas about when this all happened, but I don't want to delve into that now. It's considered unknown when it happened. There are various theories about this, but there is no precise knowledge.
So, we don't know who, but we know the indiction system, and it's somehow connected to the end of the world.
Directly.
All right, let's continue.
I want to emphasize once again that although indiction dates were abandoned, they were abandoned not so long ago. Because even in the early 17th century, manuscripts were filled with remnants of indiction dates that were transcribed following tradition. In fact, indiction itself was only abandoned in the 18th century. It was still indicated in books in the 17th century. Solar and lunar cycles were abandoned a bit earlier. So, why didn't the indiction system with 3 counters suit people? It became unsuitable when people started engaging in chronology. Let's not talk about when exactly this happened. At some point, people started engaging in chronology and began to look at these dates not in contemporary sources but in old ones. And what happens? This indiction system is triple resistant for contemporary times. That is, if there's an error somewhere, the other 2 numbers will make up for it.
Well, yes, the most stable figure is a triangle.
No, the triangle has nothing to do with it. It's about triple stability. 3 numbers fix the same year. These numbers, 15, 19, and 28, are coprime. From a mathematical standpoint, this means that these 3 cyclical counters will repeat their trio of values only after the product of these numbers. You can easily multiply 15 by 19 by 28, and you get about 8,000. It's 7,900 something. Well, almost 8,000.
So, when we come to the same value from which we started,
the entire trio, the number of years equal to 15 multiplied by 19 multiplied by 28 must pass. I don't remember exactly, but it's 7,900 something.
And, accordingly, this number would be the end of the world?
No.
Okay, I am tangled up.
Well, now we will untangle you.
All right.
Although your idea is correct, but not entirely.
Well, go ahead.
If we look at this trio in an old source, an error in one value, say, if indiction is off by 1, shifts the date by the product of the other 2 numbers. 19 times 28 equals 532. Because of an error of 1, the date went 532 years off. An error of 2 in indiction shifts it by more than 1,000 years. An error of 1 in solar cycle means 15 times 19, which is about 300 years. Hundreds of years. Errors arise when we don't know to which era this date belongs. That is, if we just want to calculate by some trio. Moreover, if we take two such trios from old sources, just looking at them, it's not clear which date is earlier and which is later. There are two trios of numbers. By looking at them, it's unclear. One must do calculations. And these are iterative calculations. You can't write a formula. Today, it's easy to do with a calculator. Back then, when they wrote with sticks and goose quills, and not everyone could.
It was difficult to do?
It was difficult to do.
Accordingly, they made mistakes.
Accordingly, they made mistakes. When people started trying to reconstruct chronology based on indiction dates, they ended up in complete chaos. Then people first realized that in public time reckoning, they had to act the same way scientists had long been acting. That is, to count years by eras. This is what we have long since adopted and what seems natural to us today. A starting point is taken, usually from ancient times. It is said that at some point in ancient times, a great event occurred, and we are now so many years from that date. All eras were introduced in this way, and from then on, we start counting. We carry forward these initial digits. Today, we carry forward 2000 and will continue to carry 2000 for a long time. 2000, 2000, 2000. We constantly repeat them, thereby providing stability to our dates. Because we repeat the same thing. When counting by era, only the lower digits change over the years, which can only slightly shift the number.
Gleb Vladimirovich, may I ask a clarifying question? According to the indiction system, what year is it now?
I can tell you how to calculate it. You need to add 5,508 to 2015. From the resulting number, take the remainder when it is divided by 15, by 19, and by 28.
So, we take the resulting number and first divide it by 15.
By 15 and take the remainder.
The remainder.
So, if it divides by 15, it will be 1 since there is no 0. If it divides by 15 with a remainder of 1, then plus 1.
2.
If it divides exactly by 15, that's 1. If with a remainder of 1, that's 2, and so on.
So, I take this remainder and first divide it by 15, then by 19, then by 28.
This sum, 2015 plus 5,508, we divide by 19, 15, and 28 and take the remainder.
Take the remainder, and this remainder is...
And add 1 to the remainder.
And add 1 to it.
Because the remainder when dividing by 15 ranges from 0 to 14, and we need from 1 to 15. The remainder when dividing by 19 ranges from 0 to 18, and we need from 1 to 19. So, take the remainder, add 1 to it, and get 3 numbers. Calculate and you'll get it.
We get 3 numbers. Now all our radio listeners are puzzled and actively calculating. Friends, add 5,508 to 2015. First divide by 19, by 15, by 28. Take the remainder and add 1.
Sorry, just a bit more clarification. Since it's now from September to December, you need to add 5,509.
While you're calculating, we'll listen to news.
Because the January year starts in January, but the indiction year starts in September, so 5,509.
Gleb Vladimirovich, while the listeners and I are calculating what year it is now according to the indiction system, let's listen to news and then come back.
Говорит Москва. Забытая история.
This is Forgotten History, 3:36 p.m. local time. Radio station, Moscow is speaking, at 94.8 FM. Olga Baikalova reminds you of the program, Forgotten History. Our guest is the Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept, The New Chronology, Gleb Nosovsky. Gleb Vladimirovich, we calculated it. During news, Gleb Vladimirovich and I calculated it, and we got 10, 1, 21.
Yes, because there was no concept of zero, and 1 had to be added.
Add 1 as the start of the count?
The smallest number at that time was 1. There was no 0. It appeared later.
So, it is now the year 10, 1, 21. What does this tell us, and how can we calculate the end of the world with this information?
Look, it's now the year 10, 1, 21. Suppose there's another year, say 12, 2, 20. Without calculation, we can't even compare these years. We don't know if the second year was earlier or later than the first. When did it occur? What is the time span between them? All this requires calculations, and iterative ones at that, which were very difficult for that time. In this sense, the indiction system of reckoning time is very good and stable for current use, but it was completely unsuitable for establishing chronology in the past. People immediately got confused with these dates when they took them from old sources. As a result, they realized that they had to switch to era-based time reckoning, which was already accepted in scholarly works. But at that time, people hadn't used it yet. In time reckoning, albeit with moans and groans, they eventually decided to switch to larger numbers. What did they do? They calculated when there was a year when all 3 counters were equal to 1. The fact is, this was already steeped in tradition and considered divine. These 3 counters, for various reasons, were considered divine, sacred, and so on. All this was within the framework of the Church. But people forgot that they were introduced at different times and for different reasons. Even their beginnings were different: March, October, September. All this was forgotten, and by that time people considered them sacred. They decided to calculate when this wonderful year was, when all 3 counters were equal to 1. They performed this calculation, and now I will say when it was. According to the new chronology, it was approximately in the era of the adoption of Christianity. It was probably related to the adoption of Christianity, when the Christian Church became state-supported and not persecuted.
Was it the year 111?
No. When it became state-supported and not persecuted. When Christian bishops received state positions and engaged in such calculations. It turned out that the year 111 was approximately 6,900 years in the past from their time. They designated this year, 111, as the year of the creation of the world, when the Lord created the world, when all 3 counters were equal to 1.
So, approximately 6,900 years ago.
Yes, approximately 6,900 years ago. What is the trick of this situation? The trick is that the date turned out to be close to 7,000. Not 7,000, but close, however not very close. About 100 years. A human lifetime is not enough to live through it. Soon, but I won't live to see it. A very tricky situation. Then scholasticism took over. On one hand, according to the Apostle Peter, 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. This is a very famous expression by the Apostle Peter. On the other hand, God created the world in 7 days. At that time, people believed that there was something divine in numbers, that numbers themselves were divine, and that the beauty of these calculations was divine. From this, they concluded that since the Lord created the world in 7 days, it would also last 7 Lord's days. The Apostle Peter said, "1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day." Therefore, 7,000 years are 7 Lord's days. In the end, they concluded that the end of the world would come in the year 7,000 from the date they calculated. And these 7,000 years were just around the corner, approximately in 100 years.
I see.
This calculation so astonished society that it was accepted by everyone. It wasn't just the opinion of some church members. It was the opinion of the church, the authorities, the scientific community, and the entire educated society of that time. As we now understand, according to the new chronology, this calculation was made approximately at the end of the 14th century, which is the era of the adoption of Christianity.
And that's how the year 1492 came about?
Yes, that's how they came up with the year 1492, though they didn't call it that. They called it the year 7000. The entire 15th century was marked by the fear of this anticipated event. Calendars and Paschal tables weren't made for dates beyond that year. The church published calendars only up to that point. After that, it was the end of the world. This was a completely accepted, scientific, and church-sanctioned opinion, endorsed by all ecclesiastical and secular authorities. Again, what's the tricky part? The trick is that the people who made this calculation, being church figures, decided to use it to correct people's behavior. They said, "You see, the end of the world is near. Be better. Behave better."
Fear is the best motivator.
They believed it was salutary. They didn't realize the bomb they were planting. They themselves didn't live to see it. They were already older adults. Clearly, they wouldn't live another 100 years. And when they died, their children and grandchildren considered them classics and believed it unconditionally.
So, no one allowed for the possibility of a mistake?
No one allowed it.
Understood.
So, what happened? There were very sharp changes. Wars, for example.
What was happening in the 15th century?
Before the year 7000, that is, 1492, people were preparing for the end of the world. There were mass suicides. People gave away their property and all their money. And this happened not only here, but throughout Europe. Which immediately raises questions. If we now look at the modern version of history, we see that according to this chronology, the year 7000 in 1492 was only recognized by us and Byzantium.
The creation era of Constantinople.
But Europeans, as we are told now, used entirely different eras of creation. Why did they have such hysteria? Historians try to explain that, sure, they used different eras, but they panicked according to ours.
Interesting.
You see the explanations? Awkward explanations, to put it mildly. According to our calculations, the book of Revelation was written precisely in the 15th century, 6 years before the end of the world, in 1486. Dante's Divine Comedy was written 15 years before that date.
So, these are all examples of mass hysteria?
Yes, and it was escalating. The Divine Comedy, the Book of Revelation, these are already at the peak of it, more calmly in the last surahs of the Quran. The Quran was also written at that time, according to the new chronology, because Muhammad and the Ottoman conquest are merged in the new chronology and placed in the 15th century. By the way, there is a group of translators who are working on translating the Quran. If the Quran is translated correctly, if the Arabic text is interpreted correctly, at least the last surahs, they haven't done the first ones yet, it will turn out that the last surahs, from about the 70th to the 100th, are exclusively about the anticipation of the end of the world, although in calmer tones because this is still the time of the founding of Kazan by Muhammad in 1438, according to the new chronology. It's in a calmer tone. They still had about 60 years, but nevertheless, it is about the constant discussion of the end of the world. This can be seen in modern translations of the Quran too, but they are so distorted that it's hard to notice. But still, if you read, you can see it even there.
So, it turns out that all these texts appear not as prophetic, but they appear based on the fact that people knew and were expecting the end of the world.
Yes, they knew and were absolutely certain that the end of the world would be in the year 7000.
Then the question immediately arises, what happened after 1492, when this date passed?
In the corridors of power, there was confusion and a very strong sense of bitterness. Special councils were convened to decide what to do. The bitterness was among those who had given away all their estates and property. Imagine a wealthy person giving away all their money and waiting for the end of the world, only for it not to come.
And how was it explained that it didn't come?
This is the next stage one want to move on to now. How was it explained that it didn't come? For example, in Russia, it was explained that the Gospels say not to try to calculate it. So, the calculations were in vain, done incorrectly. But this answer didn't satisfy many. In reality, the year 7000 is a point of divergence for all world religions.
That specific point?
That specific point.
By the way, if I'm not mistaken, it was around that time in Russia that they started using a new calendar system instead of the Constantinople calendar.
That's what historians say. They got everything mixed up.
All right, historians got everything mixed up.
Their dates are wrong. I want to tell you how it was according to our calculations and our reconstruction. What did people start doing? In their confusion, they began looking for the mistake. Many new religious movements emerged. Some extreme movements said, "We were deceived. The whole church is wrong and Christ is wrong. He is yet to come. Let's recalculate." Overall, they still adhered to the idea of the year 7000, but said that the calculation of the creation of the world was wrong. They recalculated it and came up with a new creation, which pushed the end of the world back by 1,000 or 2,000 years. For example, Jewish and Protestant calendars, they also have a creation date. According to all these creations, the year 7000 has not yet come. It is still 1,000 or 2,000 years away.
Do I understand correctly that no matter which concept we take, which calendar system we use, they all are based on the idea that there is a moment of the creation of the world, and after 7,000 years, there will be the end of the world?
Back then, they thought so, though many have forgotten this today. But in the year 7000, they relied on this idea. Many religious movements arose, including Judaism and Protestantism, which emerged around the same time. They calculated the moment of the creation differently and, accordingly, the end of the world differently. Notice that for all of them, the end of the world and the creation were significantly pushed forward and only forward, by 1,000 or 2,000 years. Moving the dates backward was pointless, since it had not occurred in the past, so it had to be in the future. At that time, the founders of these religious movements were confident and adhered to the concept that the end of the world would indeed come in the year 7000. It was just calculated incorrectly. It just ought to be recalculated. They did so by shifting these cycles. If the start of one cycle is shifted, then all three ones immediately move.
Thus, we ended up with a cascade of dates in the Middle Ages.
As a result, it was precisely then that many existing eras from the creation of the world emerged. When we talk about creation eras, there are two types. One is the functioning eras used by people, such as in Protestant and Jewish churches. The other is the so-called book creation eras, where historians open a book and say, "See, the author of this book used this creation era." This is pure trickery. It usually involves an ancient author writing the date of Christ's birth, which ancient authors also calculated differently. Modern historians claim that all the ancient authors calculated the date of Christ's birth correctly, exactly as it is considered today. And since they have different dates, it means they just calculated the creation date differently. Sometimes one author will have three different creation dates. They calculated in such a way that ended up with three different creations of the world. This is pure manipulation, the trickery of historians who, trying to convince us that no one doubted the date of Christ's birth, moved the creation date. These are the so-called scholastic Booksidates.
Gleb Vladimirovich, from the perspective of the new chronology, when exactly was the world created? We'd like to understand when we can expect the end of the world according to the new chronology. We don't have much broadcast time left, but this is a pressing question that interests everyone.
The new chronology does not deal with the doomsday calculation.
But does the new chronology know when the creation of the world actually took place? From there, we can calculate it ourselves by simply adding 7,000 years.
No, the new chronology does not deal with calculating the creation dates either. Nevertheless, the question of what the ancients understood by this is interesting. I'll say a few words on this topic, although it's just a hypothesis. First, I'll answer some listeners' questions about what the end of the world is.
Yes, how did people back then imagine the end of the world?
It's described in many books, and the description goes like this. From the east, a river of fire will flow, the seas will boil, and the mountains will be erased from the face of the earth. There's a lot written about this in the Quran and in Christian church sources. They write the same thing. A wall of fire from the east, the seas will boil, the mountains will collapse, the earth will become smooth and renewed. Absolutely everything will burn, and every person will acquire a new body at about the age of 30. That is, all our bodies will burn, both the living and the dead, as well as the unborn. All people, the dead, the living, those in the womb, will acquire a new body at the age of 30 and will go to the last judgment. After this, on this burnt, renewed earth, the last judgment will begin, and everyone will be assigned to either heaven or hell. Such a theory, such an idea, such a description can be found in many books. It must be said that it's an interesting theory.
First of all, it is interesting. Why 30 years old?
30 years is considered the age of Christ.
I see.
That's most likely where it comes from. The last judgment comes from there. But why will everything burn, a wall of fire, and the seas boil? Actually, this is interesting. I want to make a hypothesis. How much time do I have? Maybe I can do it in 2 minutes.
We have time.
Here's the thing. In the past 20 years or so, science has been grappling with the problem of the year 535 AD. In the Arctic and Antarctica, ice cores are taken, which show annual layers that go quite deep. It was discovered that in 535 AD, both at the North Pole and the South Pole, there is a significant amount of sulfur and traces of a volcanic eruption in the ice layers. Additionally, scientists have found the same evidence in the rings of common juniper growing in circumpolar areas. The common juniper is a small tree or shrub that grows in permafrost and is unaffected by any nuclear or volcanic winters. It grows very slowly, living for over 1,000 years, and its rings also show traces of something happening in 535 AD. If a volcano was powerful enough to affect both the North and South Poles simultaneously, it must have been a very large volcano. Let me give you an idea of what a large volcano is.
What kind of volcano was this?
Until recently, it was unclear what kind of volcano it was. Let me explain what a major volcanic eruption entails. It's not what we're used to. A major volcanic eruption involves a crater whose area is approximately equal to the area of Moscow, or it may be larger or smaller. Such a crater ejects a column of ash up to 100 kilometers high. Such an eruption leads to a volcanic winter lasting 10 to 15 years. Depending on where the volcano erupts, for example, in Indonesia, a layer of ash up to 10 meters thick can cover everything up to India. The temperature drops across the planet, all living things die, there are sulfuric rains, and so on. This lasts for 10 to 15 years.
So, basically, something happened in 535 AD, but it's not recorded in written sources.
Naturally, historians will find something. Procopius of Caesarea said, "It's a bit colder today." They will always find something. Or an ancient Chinese chronicler said, "This winter is very cold."
So, what is the mystery of the year 535?
You should understand that an eruption of this scale and a 15-year volcanic winter would be unbearable even for modern civilization, let alone the civilization of that time. Imagine 15 years of winter and sulfuric rains today. Do you know what would be left of our current civilization? Not much, if anything. And in the Middle Ages, the 6th century was the height of the Byzantine Empire, the time of Justinian. If such a major eruption had occurred, none of that could have existed. I want to mention that a crater with a diameter of 50 kilometers was found not long ago. This is the so-called Proto-Krakatoa. Most people are familiar with Krakatoa, a major volcano that erupted in the 19th century. That was a very large eruption. Krakatoa is just a small spot on the perimeter of this huge crater.
Where is it located?
Proto-Krakatoa is now underwater. That's why it was hard to find for so long. It fits all the parameters. Scientists are working on this, and there's a hypothesis that Proto-Krakatoa erupted in 535 AD. If that's true, it pulls the plug on all our history, axes the traditional version of history altogether.
Why?
I repeat, an eruption of this magnitude destroys any medieval civilization and even a modern one.
So, if this eruption happened in 535 AD, it means that all living things, if they existed on the planet, were wiped out.
Only a few would have survived.
But since humanity survived, it means there was no such eruption.
It's clear that humanity survived, but civilization couldn't have, and written sources couldn't have survived either.
That's why there aren't any.
So, if everything started from 535 AD, then the new chronology shows how far back we can reach.
It's such an interesting topic, but unfortunately, we're out of time.
Hello. So,
In the last broadcast, we talked about the indiction system of time reckoning. We calculated the year 1492, which in the dark medieval times was associated with the end of the world. We even figured out which indiction corresponds to the year 2015. It turned out to be, I believe, 21-1-10.
yes, but actually, we made a small error in our calculations. We should have first subtracted 1, then taken the remainder, and then added 1 to eliminate the zeros. We forgot to subtract the 1, so we actually calculated indiction for the next year, which starts on September 1st by the Julian calendar or September 14th by the Gregorian calendar. By the way, September 1st is still listed in the Menologium as the holiday, beginning of the indiction or new year. So, at one time, there was such a church holiday on September 1st, the beginning of the year. Today it starts on January 1st. This change in Russia was made under Peter the Great. First of all, I want to thank our listeners who immediately noticed this mistake, and on the same day, it was discussed on our website. It's encouraging that our research is being followed. Actually, we feel that our research is being closely followed, and we won't be allowed to make a mistake. So, thank you. Secondly, I want to use this mistake as an example to show something. Look, we made a mistake by 1 unit and as a result, got an incorrect year by 1 unit. That is, we made an error by 1 unit and got an incorrect result by 1 unit. This is a consequence of the fact that the calculations we were doing were numerically stable. I want to talk a little about that. Numerically stable calculations are those in which, if there is a small error in the initial data or in the calculations, the result also has a small error. Today, science understands what stable calculations are, and understands that unstable calculations should be avoided. They are extremely dangerous, because even if you carry them out absolutely correctly, there can be a small error in the initial data, in some parameters that you don't know exactly, and so on, and so forth.
But when it comes to the end of the world, such errors are simply unacceptable.
Absolutely correct. That's the point. When we calculated indiction from the year AD, we were doing stable calculations. But the reverse calculations are unstable. That is, when medieval scholars calculated the era from indictions, solar cycles, and lunar cycles which they found somewhere, those were unstable calculations. I repeat, an error of just 1 unit in indiction results in an error of 532 years in the era. An error of 1 unit in solar cycle results in 285 years. An error of 1 unit in lunar cycle results in 420 years. An error of 2 units doubles the error accordingly. The tiniest errors in the initial data magnify errors in the final result enormously. But people back then didn't understand what unstable calculations meant. They calculated, summed, multiplied, and thought that if they did everything correctly, performed the arithmetic operations correctly, they would get the correct answer. Not so. Because if the calculations are fundamentally unstable, they will still get the wrong answer. Because an insignificant, small error can creep into the initial data, which, due to unstable nature of calculations, gets extremely magnified, and in the end, results in an incorrect answer. The founders of our chronology, Scaliger and Petavius, constantly carried out unstable calculations. Another example of unstable calculations is the calculations based on the equinox day. For instance, in old sources, the equinox day is mentioned, stating that a certain event occurred when the equinox day was at such and such a time. The equinox day shifts by 1 day every 128 years. That is, approximately 1 day every 130 years. Suppose the observer in the source made an error by 1 day, then we get an error of 130 years. By 2 days, 260 years.
Wait, but isn't it established now that the equinox falls on a specific date?
The equinox falls on a specific date because our calendar was specifically adjusted after the Gregorian calendar reform. It was reformed so that the equinox would always fall on March 21st. Previously, there was the Julian calendar. There are Julian and Gregorian calendars. In the Julian, the equinox date drifted.
Drifted?
Of course, it drifted.
Did February 29th exist according to the Julian calendar?
Under the Julian calendar, as well as under the Gregorian, there were leap years.
There were?
Yes, there were. The Gregorian calendar differs from the old one in that 3 out of every 4 century years are not leap years, while the 4th is. The year 2000 was the 4th one and was a leap year as usual. But, for example, the year 1900 in the Gregorian calendar was not a leap year. The years 1800 and 1700 were not leap years. Each time a day accumulated between the new and old calendars. Every 4th of the century years remains a leap year. The year 2000, since it was the 4th, remained a leap year, and we just didn't notice it. The Gregorian calendar differs from the Julian one in that it is adjusted to the length of the tropical year, which is the time interval between 2 equinoxes. There is also the sidereal year, which is the period of the Earth's orbit around the Sun. The lengths of the Earth's orbit around the Sun and the time interval between 2 equinoxes are slightly different. The Julian calendar sets the length of the year approximately in the middle between these 2 values, the sidereal year and the tropical year. In fact, it was a very reasonable system, simple, without unnecessary complications and without leaps. Every 4 years was a leap year, and the length of the year was in the middle between these 2 natural definitions. But this was not liked, so it was shifted towards the tropical year. In general, from a scientific point of view, the reform was pointless.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory. This is so that they can constantly scare us with the end of the world.
No, this is not a conspiracy theory. I just want to say that the calculations made by medieval scholars, including those underpinning the Gregorian calendar reform, were quite incompetent. By the way, we have a specific book on this topic called Easter. It describes everything about the Gregorian calendar reform in detail and so on. I want to say that in old sources, the equinox date is not exact. It is known that even in the 14th century, the equinox date was recorded with an error of 6 days. And this wasn't in some random manuscripts, but for example, in the book by Matthew Blasteres. This is a canonical Constantinople book, and Constantinople was considered the pinnacle, the place where the best scholarly minds of the 14th century gathered. And they made such errors. In fact, there's nothing surprising about this. But it's important to understand that errors were possible. Today, some scholars, for instance, our critics, doctors of astronomical sciences, say, let's date the Almagest by the equinox date. This is an unstable method. It can contain a huge number of errors that will lead to instability. I repeat, when calculating dates, when establishing chronology, it is very important to work with stable methods. A stable method is like walking on a wide, even road. An unstable method is like walking on a tightrope. One small misstep and you fall.
Gleb Vladimirovich, before we move directly to the end of the world, we have a question from a listener on this topic. I suggest we listen to it.
Okay, let's do it.
To exactly understand the chronology, let's listen to a couple of questions. Please put on your headphones. Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Gleb Vladimirovich, your methods may be as good and mathematically correct as you like, but you apply them to data whose reliability is questionable. For processing such data, completely different mathematical methods are used, such as fuzzy logic. How do you justify the reliability of your conclusions? Fomenko writes, it may be true, or it may not be. On what scale do you measure the reliability of your final results, and how do you assess them?
Thank you.
Actually, I just talked about this. Fuzzy logic has nothing to do with it. But indeed, the inaccuracy of the initial data needs to be considered. Therefore, when calculating a certain value related to chronology, it is necessary to take into account that the initial data may be inaccurate. Of course, we constantly consider this. I want to say that a competent scientist today takes this into account, whereas in the Middle Ages, Even competent scientists did not, or might not have considered it. Actually, our current chronology is also based on calculations. Don't think it is based on some knowledge handed down from the heavens. No, it is based on calculations. Just as we use astronomical data today to calculate something in chronology, so did Scaliger and Petavius. They were calculating it. I will give this comparison once again. Stable calculations are like walking on a solid, wide road. Unstable ones are like walking on a tightrope. A millimeter to the right, a millimeter to the left, and you fall. Calculations performed by Scaliger and Petavius were like constantly walking on a tightrope, and they constantly fell. There are many examples. Competent calculations, of course, should be stable. Naturally, we always evaluate the errors in our calculations.
Alexander is wondering, did Babylonian and Egyptian astrologers who recorded the coordinates of celestial bodies also make errors of several days?
Babylonian and Egyptian astronomers are significantly different matters. Egyptian astronomy indeed left a lot of data behind, which are compiled in the Almagest. We have thoroughly examined the Almagest and showed that the oldest parts of the Almagest, specifically the Egyptian observations, date back approximately to the 10th century AD. That is the oldest part. It was written down later. Ptolemaic system itself was developed in the 13th century. We even have a fairly accurate dating based on the zodiac of astronomy, where the development of the Ptolemaic system is depicted and dated to the year 1228. The conventional date for the development of the Ptolemaic system in Egypt is 130 AD. This is an unstable dating method based on the equinox date, which relies on data that had been tampered with to begin with. It is known, and even Robert Newton studied this and showed that the longitudes in the Almagest were recalculated. There are traces of this recalculation, which have been proven. Therefore, first, longitudes are easily recalculated and could have been recalculated in the past. Thus, calculations based on them are generally meaningless. Furthermore, calculations based on longitudes and the equinox date are unstable. Historians have unstably dated it to the year 130 AD. We have dated it stably. Our methods are stable. I repeat, the oldest part of the Almagest dates to the 10th century AD. It was being edited up to the 16th century. The development of the Ptolemaic system of the world dates to the 13th century. That is regarding Egyptian astronomy. As for Babylonian astronomy, we also studied this. Its significance is greatly exaggerated and inflated. There are no star coordinates in Babylonian astronomy. Yes, the cuneiform tablets contain mentions of planetary conjunctions. Essentially, these are horoscopes. But they are fragmentary, not sufficiently complete, and besides, the names of the planets are not always indicated and cannot always be fully deciphered. Even if we set aside these difficulties with the names and assume that historians have deciphered everything correctly, there is still formally insufficient data for dating. The datings proposed by historians are not actual datings. Essentially, this is again some kind of trickery. We have written about this in our books.
Gleb Vladimirovich, let's summarize. We're gradually approaching the topic of the end of the world. To understand how the date of the end of the world is determined, we need to understand from which exact moment the world begins. That is, the creation of the world. Then, according to the indiction system, everything resets. The end of the world happens.
No, it's not quite like that. The indiction system has nothing to do with it. The indiction system was used to calculate the date of the creation of the world, and then scholasticism took over. Since the Lord created the world in 7 days, and 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, if He created the world in 7 days, then it will last 7 Lord's days. This is the medieval scholastic theory. According to it, from the creation of the world to the end of the world, exactly 7 Lord's days or 7,000 years will pass.
So, if the idea of the end of the world appears and it is scholastic, it immediately casts doubt on religious dogmas.
No, look, the idea of the end of the world and the calculation of the end of the world are different things. The idea of the end of the world is not scholastic. It arose from other considerations. It has been inherent in our culture from the very beginning. It is ancient, but the idea of calculating the end of the world is purely scholastic. These are different things. The end of the world itself has been described in many sources. Moreover, the ancients said that the end of the world cannot be calculated. It is known only to God, and you shouldn't try to do it. Nevertheless, people turned a blind eye to these reasonings and still tried to calculate it. And they did calculate it, as I explained last time, which led to great calamities, the death of many people, and severe misfortunes for civilization. In this sense, I want to say that these calculations are not harmless. You see, when they touch on such fundamental aspects of culture and faith, they can cause significant harm.
Please tell me, has the idea of the end of the world always been about the complete physical destruction of humanity on the planet?
Yes, the idea of the end of the world has always been about that. Let's look at what is written in the book of Revelation. Although theologians usually try not to associate the revelation directly with the end of the world. However, according to our calculations, the revelation was written 6 years before the year 7000 in anticipation of the end of the world, and the imminent one at that. Look at what is written. And when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed. This clearly describes the end of the world. When another millennium ends. It's written directly here. For some reason, being confused by the chronology, theologians have not paid attention to this. They think it refers to the 2nd century AD, during another millennium since the creation. But here it is written clearly. And it continues. And fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. That is, fire came down from heaven and burned everything. As I described last time, the concept of the end of the world involves a wave of fire sweeping from the east and burning everything. The earth will be renewed. There will be a new earth, and the dead will rise. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. So, all the dead will be resurrected. And then everything will burn. And then everything will be renewed. And then the last judgment will begin. This is all written in the Revelation. And not only in the Revelation. There are many books where this is described in detail. In the Revelation, it is mentioned briefly because it is assumed that the reader already knows it well. In reality, there are books where this is described in detail. It is a church tradition, very well known. As I said last time, it is quite possible that this tradition is related to some very ancient memories of humanity about the year 535 AD, about the volcanic eruption. But this is just a hypothesis.
You advised me to read what English language sources say about the year 535. There is indeed information on this. Researchers' opinions on this issue vary. Some talk about a volcano, some talk about a super catastrophe, some talk about some systemic ecological failure. There are indeed studies about the mystery of the year 535.
I agree. The jury is still out on that subject.
Last time you talked about ice cores, in which fallout of the year 535 is found. They are found in tree rings that live up to 1,500 years, in the remains of some animals. But the period from 534 to 537 is referenced.
It's possible. 535 AD is, of course, an approximate date, but 534 to 537 is not that wide a range.
According to this theory, something happened on Earth over a span of 3 years.
Yes, and perhaps more than 3 years, because 3 years is the maximum, and the consequences could have lasted longer. This issue issue needs further investigation. If the volcanic eruption occurred in 535 and was of such magnitude, we know that the consequences can last up to 15 years.
So, it's possible that all these end-of-the-world concepts began to emerge spontaneously by 1492. This includes Dante's Divine Comedy and the Book of Revelation. I understand they were written before that date.
Yes, the Revelation in 1486. We dated it and we have a book called The Number of the Beast, when the Book of Revelation was written. It's a small book, but it's also mentioned in our larger books. The Divine Comedy was written 15 years before the date, in 1477.
1477. Correct me if I'm wrong. There is a hypothesis that all these depictions of the end of the world, where all living things on earth burn, and humanity is completely annihilated, are echoes of the catastrophe that happened in 535 AD.
From the perspective of the new chronology, this is a natural assumption. Because from the perspective of the chronology we are used to, such a major catastrophe in 535 could not have happened. Such a major catastrophe would have destroyed the civilization described by historians. The 6th century is the time of Justinian, the flourishing of culture, Byzantium, Rome, and so on. Such a catastrophe that would have destroyed civilization is not mentioned in the annals. If somewhere it is written that there was a cold winter, and historians try to link this to the year 535, there are such attempts, but it is not serious.
We have many questions from our listeners. Today we are talking about the end of the world. In our radio studio, we have Gleb Nisovsky, Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University and co-author of the concept The New Chronology. Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon. I have 2 questions. The first question: when you dated the star catalog, this task can be approached from the perspective of signal reception in general. That is, using a purely correlation receiver. Therefore, from my point of view, in principle, longitude could be used since it mainly involves the relative longitude of one star relative to another. It would be interesting to look at this purely using correlation methods. If you have students or postgraduates, how can these longitudes and correlation methods be used to determine the errors of the instruments that were used back then and the manipulations or recalculations you mentioned? Ideally, they should get exposed as well.
This is question number 1.
And second, a question-comment. What you mentioned about the additive number system is, in principle, similar to the Chinese remainder theorem or the residue number system, for which, unfortunately, there is very little literature available.
Thank you.
It seems you enjoy reading popular scientific literature but don't delve deeply into it, repeating some terms from it. Firstly, you clearly haven't read our book on dating the Almagest, which actually starts with a statistical analysis of the errors in longitudes and latitudes, finding the systematic error, compensating for this error, and so on. In reality, mathematical statistics is quite a complex science with many subtleties. If you had read our book, you probably wouldn't have asked such a question. Moreover, many people like to repeat the word correlation without understanding much about it.
Friends, this is the radio show, Forgotten History. Unfortunately, now we are taking a break for the news. Our guest is Gleb Nisovsky. We will listen to the news and then continue discussing the end of the world, and we will talk about the figure of the Antichrist.
Забытая история.
3:36 p.m. local time. Radio station, Moscow is speaking, 94.8 FM. Olga Baikalova in the studio. This is the program, Forgotten History. Today, we are talking about the end of the world. In the studio, we have Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept The New Chronology, Gleb Nisovsky. Gleb Vladimirovich, before the news, we had a caller who asked 2 short questions. As far as I understood, One was about longitudes and the inductive numbering system. In the second, he noted that traces of this system exist in China. He called it the residue number system. Frankly, it sounds like gibberish to me. I don't know anything about either of these topics. So, I turn the reins over to you to explain what he meant.
It is indeed a mishmash of poorly connected and largely meaningless words. But, in fact, if we look at history, everything was invented in China, including gunpowder. By the way, in the 19th century, the Chinese published an ancient Chinese table of logarithms that was copied from a European edition, even without correcting the typographical errors present in the table. It caused a big scandal. Chinese history is a very interesting subject. This is indeed very interesting, where it all came from. I refer you to our books, The Piebald Horde, and the chapter on China in the book, Empire. Additionally, we have a book already sent to the press that will be published soon, titled, The Last Journey of the Holy Family. It details everything about China and where all ancient Chinese stuff came from. Let's move on to the next questions.
Wait, did the Chinese also invent the Antichrist?
Are we going to talk about China now? That's a huge topic.
No, let's talk about China another time. Let's focus on the end of the world. When did the concept of the Antichrist appear?
The theory of the Antichrist appeared later than the theory of the end of the world. I don't know exactly when this theory emerged, but I want to point out that in Russia in the 17th century, it was widely used to weaken Russian society in the mid-17th century.
Для того, чтобы ослабить русское общество в середине 17 века. Вот я открою книгу такую, называется «Книга о вере». Эта книга была издана...
I have here a book called The Book of Faith, published by the Moscow print yard.
So, you are now holding in your hands a book that...
From 1648.
How old? 400 years?
Well, a little less.
A little less, almost 400 years. Oh la la!
This is the Book of Faith. It was printed in Moscow. It even says here, by the command of the pious, Christ-loving sovereign, Tsar and Grand Prince Alexei Mikhailovich, ruler of all Russia, and so on, and so on, and by the blessing of Joseph, the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia, printing of this new book has begun. And so on and so forth. It states here, in the reigning city of Moscow in the year 7156. Subtracting from 7156. We don't know whether this date was before or after September, so let's assume before. Then we subtract 5508, and we get the year 1648. If it's after September, it's 1647, as we would need to subtract 5509. But it doesn't matter.
So, it's 1647 or 48.
Usually, when the month is unknown, 5508 is subtracted. Now, let's see what is written in this book, which by the command of the Tsar and the blessing of the Patriarch was published and distributed among the Russian people in 1648. Listen to this. Little children, it is the last time. And as ye have heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists. Truly, many forerunners of the Antichrist have already been, but he himself is already near, according to the number 666. It is the number of a man, the number of the Antichrist, who knows, maybe in this year 1666 he will appear. The date is clearly written. No one will undoubtedly indicate his forerunners or the Antichrist himself, because this is the Antichrist, and so on. Further, it talks about the Antichrist. Look.
Two numbers, 666 and...
It says 666, and from this, the conclusion is drawn, and it is clearly written that soon, in 1666, the Antichrist will come.
How did this date come about? How did the number 666 appear?
666 is taken from the book of Revelation. In the Revelation, it is said about several beasts that will appear before the end of the world. And it is said that one of these beasts will have the number of a man. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So, in the Revelation, the number 666 is called the number of a man. This number was on a certain beast, and thus, through a rather cunning, purely propagandistic technique, it was manipulated. Back then, propaganda was mastered no worse than now, and perhaps even better. In reality, the number of a man 666, 3 sixes, as we have shown, is derived from the actual date of the Nativity of Christ. Because in the era from the creation, the Nativity of Christ is the year 6660. According to the new chronology, the year 1152 is the year 6660. Without the zero, this number is represented by 3 sixes, 6660. In the non-positional numeral system, thousands were depicted the same way as units, with a separate mark. Therefore, 6 in the units place, transformed into thousands, 6 in the hundreds place, and 6 in the tens place, 3 sixes. These are 3 letters of the Church Slavonic alphabet. In the era from the creation, 3 sixes represented the correct but forgotten nativity of Christ.
So, the 3 sixes are the date of Christ's birth?
Yes, it is the correct date of Christ's birth, the year 1152.
How did the sixes become the number of the Antichrist?
The number of the Antichrist is also 3 sixes. They just moved the thousands to the units. It's the same letter. We believe that the author of the book of Revelation understood that this referred to the date of Christ's birth, as it was still remembered. He speaks of the coming of the Antichrist because the theory of the Antichrist is already present in the Revelation. It contains the end of the world and the Antichrist. By that time, some stories about the Antichrist had already been created, and he was already present in the Revelation. Talking about the end of the world, the Antichrist, and the Last Judgment, naturally, he mentions the date of Christ's birth, calling it, incidentally, the number of a man. The fact that it was written on the beast doesn't matter. In reality, the beasts in the Revelation are astral symbols. He plainly says that it is the number of a man. If you remember, Christ called himself the Son of Man, so there is even some connection here. In any case, purely chronologically, the 3 sixes represent the date of Christ's birth. According to our calculations, in the Revelation, these 3 sixes most likely meant the date of Christ's birth, because it was discussed that Christ came, and that was the first coming, and there would be the second. The Revelation is about the second coming. So, the appearance of this date is not surprising. It was simply misunderstood and distorted. It was claimed that it was some terrifying number of the beast. It's not the number of Christ, but the number of the Antichrist. This theory was implanted. Moreover, the authorities straight out told people that the end of the world would be in 1666 based on the mention of 666 in the Revelation.
And what happened in 1667 when the end of the world did not occur?
In that sense, nothing happened at all then. What happened? Around that time, the schism occurred.
Russian
society was oppressed. There were a large number of self-immolations. People were in confusion, and they did not resist the authorities. Why? Because they were convinced that the end of the world was near and the Antichrist was coming. They were told all this in books.
And is this somehow related to the church reform of Patriarch Nikon? There was a church schism at that time.
Related is not the right word. I think these actions pursued the same goal, the destruction of Russian society. You must understand that the schism and the introduction of the idea of the end of the world were blows aimed at the psyche of society. It was like a kind of war against Russian society by the authorities of that time, who were actually illegitimate. We have written about this in detail. The Romanovs were not legitimate rulers. By the way, in their first books, they claimed that Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov was the son of Fyodor Ivanovich, the grandson of Ivan the Terrible. Later, they changed this version. But initially, they started with this version. In the books of the Moscow print house, they openly declared that they were direct descendants of Fyodor Ivanovich and Ivan the Terrible. This was not true. Later, they came up with another version, that they were relatives of Anastasia Romanovna. You see, lies are not replaced with the truth. Lies are always replaced with other lies. This is a characteristic of people. I want to say that if in the year 7000, that is, in 1492, the anticipation of the end of the world by the authorities and the church was sincere, then by the 17th century, this was deliberately exploited. After the failed end of the world, it was understood that the calculations were wrong, but it was also understood how strongly this affected society. Before the year 7000, society was very agitated, put into a trance. Remembering how strongly this affected society, how much it unsettled it, this time they deliberately spread the idea with a direct indication of the date. They just scholastically linked it to the year 1666.
One small clarification. When we talk about the authorities and society as a whole, whether in the 14th or the 17th century, what territories are we talking about? Are we referring to medieval Europe, medieval Russia?
According to the new chronology, until 1613, the rule in the civilized world was unified. So, when we talk about the year 7000, there was one empire. Of course, it was organized quite in a complicated manner, and local authorities had quite significant rights. But, nevertheless, at any time, the emperor could come and hang the vassal on the gates.
So, we are basically talking about one great empire.
Yes, but in the mid-17th century, in 1648, of course, it was no longer the case. The empire had already collapsed, and in its former metropolis, Moscow, the Romanovs ruled, certainly not on their own. They were the henchmen of the rebels who had dismantled the empire.
Tell me, was the theory of the Antichrist popular only in Russia, or was this topic also touched upon in medieval Europe?
In Europe, the idea was much less prominent, let me put it that way. As I've already shown in which books, the theory of the Antichrist was heavily promoted in Russia in the 17th century. Surely, it is present in church tradition, and from quite late times, as I think. It is present in the book of Revelation, but it didn't reach the level of hysteria in the West that it did in Russia.
This is the program, Forgotten History. Today we are discussing the end of the world. In the studio, we have Gleb Nosovsky, an associate professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University and co-author of the concept, The New Chronology. Friends, your questions on the topic. Hello, your question to our guest.
Hello, I am astonished by the amateurism of your professor, who claims that the idea of the Antichrist arose only in the 17th century. There are long-standing writings that show the revelation was written in the 1st century, and the idea of the Antichrist was present in the teachings of Christ himself, who stated that false Christs and false prophets would come. When the disciples asked Christ about the end of the world, he warned them that neither the angels nor the Son know this. That is, even he admitted that he does not know this date, only the Father in heaven does.
What's the question?
I get the impression that your professor is ignoring obvious historical facts.
Yes, thank you. We will address this. I understand the question, and I'll rephrase it. There seems to be some confusion because, from our listener's perspective, the Revelation was written in the 1st century. According to the new chronology, the Revelation was written in 1486.
Of course, it's clear that our listener is adhering to Scaliger's chronology, which dates the Revelation to the 1st century. Moreover, he didn't catch everything I said. We are certainly not claiming that the idea of the Antichrist originated in the 17th century. We assert that it was utilized in the 17th century in Russian society. The concept already exists in the Revelation, which we date to the 15th century. Overall, it's understandable that people who are accustomed to Scaliger's chronology and the traditional historical narrative taught from school books have difficulty adjusting to a new perspective, and thus they flounder, as evidenced by this listener.
Alexander Feldman writes, as far as I remember, the book of Revelation is contained in the Codex Sinaiticus, which is archaeologically 17 centuries old.
Archaeological dating of codices and other ancient objects and books is a serious issue that needs thorough research. This topic is covered in detail in the books by Anatoly Fomenko. I refer you to these books, read them, and then ask questions.
Gleb Vladimirovich, if we return to the topic of the end of the world, is anyone currently engaged in such calculations? How do historians view this theory today?
No, this theory has long since fallen out of the realm of science. Although, up until the beginning of the 18th century, serious scholars within academic circles did attempt to calculate the correct end of the world. Interestingly, this was done not in Russia but, for example, in England. Maybe it was done in Russia as well, but I'm not aware of it. By the middle of the 18th century, scholars had stopped engaging in these follies. Today, of course, it is not considered science. But I wanted to say something else. I wanted to say that this theory, on one hand, indeed might trace its roots back to true antiquity, to the year 535. Whether this is true or not, the year 7000, or 1492, showed just how sensitive and close to the human heart it is. This is an empirical fact. People overlook some things, while others they cling to passionately. This is a peculiarity of human psychology. In 7000, that is 1492, it became evident, showed itself vividly, and in the 17th century, it was specifically used for propaganda purposes against Russian society. And it was used very effectively, I must say. It was one of the powerful methods of exerting pressure on Russian society in the 17th century.
Look, regarding the end of the world, it's clear that today probably only Hollywood actively exploits this topic, making various religious films. However, when we talk about the end of the world, do we rely only on the book of Revelation?
No, of course not. The theory of the end of the world is not only in the Revelation, it is even more detailed in other sources. There are many apocrypha. There is the book of Daniel, which describes the end of the world in detail. There is a book called the Spiritual Meadow, which also talks about the end of the world. In the church tradition, there are detailed descriptions of the end of the world. I have already recounted them. I repeat, the Quran's last surahs speak a lot about the end of the world. By the way, let me make another assumption. Why not? According to the new chronology, Muhammad lived in the 15th century. History shifts. According to the old chronology, he lived in the 7th century, and Christ in the 1st century. Now Christ is in the 12th century according to the new chronology, and Muhammad falls into the 15th century and aligns with the Ottoman conquest. This means, relatively speaking, it remains roughly the same in relation to Christ, even bringing him a bit closer. If we look from the perspective of the new chronology at what Muhammad wrote in the Quran, and generally at his activities, it becomes evident that, according to the new chronology, he was of royal lineage. He wasn't some poor desert dweller. According to the new chronology, he was of royal descent and might have known some ancient traditions that existed in this ancient royal lineage. The very idea of starting the Muslim Hijri era from the flight in 622 could also be associated with some memories that something started in the 7th century. Such memories might have existed. Later, it was claimed that this was Muhammad's flight from somewhere to somewhere. Although, according to the new chronology, this was his flight from Moscow, i.e., Mecca, to Medina, i.e., Kazan, where we found the Kaaba. We have a book, Where Moses Walked. It tells in detail about Muhammad, about the Kaaba near Kazan, which no one pays attention to today. You can simply go there. Only the foundation remains of the true Kaaba. I want to say that he probably remembered a lot, and perhaps his Hijri era is somehow connected with vague memories that something started somewhere in the 6th, 7th centuries.
This is the Forgotten History program, with Gleb Nasovsky in the studio. Your questions, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, we have time to ask our guest one more question.
Good afternoon. Michal from Moscow. I am a supporter of the scientific aspect of the new chronology theory by Nasovsky and Fomenko.
Fomenko and Nasovsky.
Please tell me, do you think that the dating of the Shroud of Turin confirms your theory? Because, as I understand it, based on the radiocarbon analysis of the blood traces in the shroud itself, it was dated to the 12th-13th century.
Thank you, Mihail.
Absolutely correct. In the book, Tsar of the Slavs, we have a detailed analysis of the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin, where we date the era of Christ and, among other things, use the Shroud of Turin for this. There are many different independent methods of dating the era of Christ presented there. We thoroughly examine the radiocarbon analysis of the shroud. There are some nuances. Not all results were interpreted correctly. Most likely, the measurements were accurate, but there were purely statistical stretches. Nevertheless, if all the stretches are corrected, the dating indeed falls into the 12th century. They stretched it to the 14th century. In this case, they didn't age it, but rather made it younger. I refer you to our book, Tsar of the Slavs, where this is written in great detail.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the program's time is coming to an end. This is Forgotten History. Associate Professor of the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics of Moscow State University, co-author of the concept The New Chronology, Gleb Nasovsky, was in the studio. Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you very much for coming. Please come again.
Thank you.